There is a particular kind of fear that never announces itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with drums or speeches. It settles in quietly, like weather changing, and the men who feel it first are usually the ones who've spent their lives learning to read what's coming. Robert E. Lee was that kind of man. He had spent 40 years studying war, studying men, cataloging the instincts that separate commanders who win from those who merely fight. He had developed an almost preternatural ability to anticipate what his opponents would do, to feel the hesitation in their movements before the orders were even written. That gift had made him, by the spring of 1864, arguably the most dangerous military mind on the continent. He had outmaneuvered Pope at Second Manassas, humiliated Burnside at Fredericksburg, conjured something close to a miracle at Chancellorsville. He had looked at every man the Union sent against him and found, beneath the braid and the rank, the same exploitable thread, the impulse to protect, to pause, to reconsider. He had pulled that thread every time. Then they sent him Grant. And something shifted in Lee's posture, in the way he spoke to his staff, in the calculations he ran at night. Because Ulysses Grant was not a man Lee could thread. He was not a man who paused. And what Lee understood, what he articulated with a quiet precision that his officers found unsettling, was that the war had just changed its nature. Not its geography, not its politics, not its stated aims. Its nature. The logic that had governed 4 years of campaigns in Virginia, the chess-like economy of maneuver and position that Lee had mastered, was about to be overwritten by something older and blunter, and in the end, more powerful. Lee had warned them. He had seen it coming from 1,000 miles away, and he could not stop it. That is the story that gets lost in the mythology of the Civil War. We have spent a century and a half constructing two particular monuments, Lee as the marble general, noble and tragic, the embodiment of a lost and somehow honorable cause, Grant as the butcher, the drunk, the man who won only because he was willing to spend lives the way other men spent money. Both monuments are wrong, but the second one is not just wrong, it is an inversion of the truth so complete that it amounts to a kind of historical sabotage. Because Ulysses Grant was not a blunt instrument, he was a scalpel, and the manner in which he disassembled Robert E. Lee's army, not by outfighting it in the romantic sense, but by outthinking it at every structural level, represents one of the most sophisticated military performances in American history. Lee knew this. He said so. And the fact that his warning went largely unheeded by his own people and was later buried under the lost cause's need for a dignified villain tells us something important, not just about the Civil War, but about how America has chosen to remember it. Ulysses Grant was born in 1822 in a small Ohio town called Point Pleasant, which was neither particularly pointed nor especially pleasant, and which he left as quickly as circumstances allowed. His father was a tanner, a practical man, who recognized in his son a quietness that could be mistaken for vacancy, and who pushed him toward West Point less out of military ambition than out of a desire to see the boy educated at government expense. Grant did not want to go. He was not the kind of young man who dreamed of glory. He was the kind of young man who was good with horses and who felt, in the presence of most human social machinery, a bone-deep discomfort that he never entirely lost. He went to West Point because he was told to. He graduated in the middle of his class. He was good at mathematics, exceptional with horses, and largely unimpressed by the pageantry that animated most of his classmates. What Grant carried out of West Point was not a theory of war. It was something more durable. A clarity about what war actually demanded, stripped of the aesthetic layer that made it palatable to gentlemen. He had read Jomini, as all officers of his generation had, but he absorbed that formal geometry without being seduced by it. He understood war as a problem of logistics before it was a problem of tactics, and he understood that the men who lost wars usually lost them not in the grand set-piece collision, but in the accumulation of smaller failures. Supply lines fraying, morale eroding, the arithmetic of attrition finally running out. He was 22 years old and had never commanded anything larger than a company drill, but the architecture of how he thought about conflict was already fundamentally different from the men he would one day face. The Mexican War gave him his first real education. He served under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, two commanders as different as men could be, and he watched both of them with the same quiet, encyclopedic attention he'd given to horses in Ohio. Grant was blunt and aggressive, uninterested in elegance, and he won. Scott was precise and theatrical, obsessed with the professional choreography of campaign, and he also won, but in a way that Grant less, because Scott's victories depended on the enemy behaving predictably. What Grant took from Mexico was not a preferred style. It was a conviction that the objective mattered more than the method, and that any commander who let aesthetic preference override operational necessity was carrying a liability he might not be able to afford. He also served in Mexico, alongside a young officer named Robert E. Lee, and Grant, who was not given to effusive assessments of other men, came away from that proximity with a precise and largely uncomplimentary view of what Lee was. Brilliant, gifted, ferociously skilled within a particular framework, and what he was not. Grant never published this view. He was not the publishing type, but it lived in him, and when the time came, it shaped every decision he made. After Mexico, the Army sent Grant to a series of posts so remote and so bereft of purpose that they amounted, in practice, to a slow bureaucratic suffocation. He was stationed at Sackett Harbor in upstate New York, then Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory, then Fort Humboldt on the California coast. He was separated from his wife Julia, whom he loved with a constancy that was one of the more quietly remarkable facts of his life, and he was given almost nothing to do. The combination produced what it might have produced in almost any man: depression, drinking, a creeping conviction that the life he was living was not the life he had been built for. He resigned from the Army in 1854, and the official record does not clarify whether the resignation was his choice or an ultimatum from his commanding officer over the drinking. It was probably both. What followed was 8 years that the mythology of Grant requires us to understand as failure. He tried farming and was not good at it. He tried selling real estate and was not good at that either. He tried bill collecting in St. Louis, a job so humiliating for a former Army officer that his acquaintances reportedly crossed the street to avoid the awkwardness of acknowledgement. He eventually ended up as a clerk in his younger brother's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois at the age of 38, with a wife, 4 children, and no visible prospects. The man who would eventually receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia was, in the spring of 1860, unable to reliably support his own household. This is where the mythology goes wrong in a specific and instructive way. The story that gets told about Grant's pre-war years is a story of waste, of a man drowning his talent in whiskey and mediocrity. But what actually happened in those 8 years was more interesting than that. Grant was not wasting. He was observing. He was living with an unusual intimacy among the people and the physical landscapes that would later constitute the theater of war. He had farmed in Missouri. He had traveled through the Middle South. He had developed an understanding of terrain, of rural logistics, of the practical constraints of moving men and material through country without infrastructure that his West Point-trained opponents, most of whom had spent their careers in either garrison or classroom, simply did not have. His failure, read properly, was a form of education. When the war came, Grant moved faster than almost anyone around him. He did not agonize over which side to choose. He was from Ohio, and he believed in the Union with a plainness that had no patience for the elaborate moral geometries other men deployed to arrive at their positions. He organized a volunteer company in Galena and immediately noticed that most of the men who were being given commands in the new Union Army were either political appointees with no military training or West Pointers who had been too cautious in their ambitions to build reputations before the war. He was neither. He had the training and the experience, and he no longer had the caution. He wrote to the Adjutant General's office in Washington offering his services, received no response, wrote again, and eventually got himself in front of the right Illinois politician at the right moment. He was commissioned as colonel of the 21st Illinois Infantry in June 1861. What Grant did over the next 18 months reads, in retrospect, like a systematic demonstration of the principles he'd been quietly assembling his entire life. Fort Donelson, in February 1862, was the first major example. He surrounded a Confederate garrison of approximately 12,000 men, withstood a breakout attempt that temporarily fractured his lines, and responded to the Confederate commander's request for terms with a sentence so perfectly calibrated to his own nature that it became, briefly, the most famous sentence in America. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The initials worked out. U.S. Grant. Unconditional Surrender Grant. The country needed a hero, and it took the initials and ran with them. But the substance mattered more than the branding. Grant had demonstrated at Donelson that he understood something fundamental about how wars end, not in the brilliant tactical stroke, but in the closing of doors. He had closed every door Fort Donelson had. The Confederates had nowhere to go. That was not an accident. Shiloh, 2 months later, complicated the heroism considerably. Grant was caught flat-footed on the first day, his army pushed back toward the Tennessee River by a Confederate assault he had failed to anticipate, and the casualty figures, over 13,000 Union dead, wounded, or missing in 2 days, produced the first serious call for his removal. Lincoln received the petitions, reviewed the reports, and gave what became one of the more significant responses of his presidency. "I can't spare this man." It was characteristically Lincolnian, simple on the surface, devastatingly precise underneath. What Lincoln had understood by the spring of 1862 was that the Union's central problem was not a shortage of men or material. It had plenty of both. Its problem was a shortage of commanders who were willing to use them. Grant was willing. That was not a small thing. The Vicksburg Campaign, which consumed most of 1862 and 1863, was the performance that separated Grant from every other Union commander in the Western Theater. The city sat on bluffs above the Mississippi River, protected by the river on one side and swamp on the other, and conventional military theory held that it could not be taken without a direct assault from the north that would have been catastrophic. Grant looked at the conventional military theory and started looking for another approach. He spent months probing, feinting, failing in interesting ways that told him things he needed to know. Then, in the spring of 1863, he made a decision that his own subordinates thought bordered on recklessness. He crossed the Mississippi below Vicksburg, cut loose from his supply line entirely, and marched his army through Confederate Mississippi, living on the land, winning 5 separate engagements in 17 days before laying siege to the city from the east. It fell on July 4th. The Mississippi was open. The Confederacy was cut in half. What is worth sitting with in the Vicksburg campaign is not the audacity of the maneuver, though it was genuinely audacious, but the control underneath it. Grant was not improvising. Every apparent gamble was a calculated risk, every apparent chaos a managed uncertainty. He knew what he had, knew what the terrain permitted, knew what the Confederate command in the region would and would not do, and he designed his campaign around that knowledge with a precision that would have impressed anyone who assumed, based on his manner, that he was operating on instinct alone. He was not. He was the most analytical commander in the American Army, and he was doing it in a way that looked, from the outside, like blunt aggression. That gap between appearance and reality would follow him for the rest of his life and do enormous damage to his historical reputation. Chattanooga in November 1863 was almost a coda. Grant arrived to find an army besieged on all sides, half-starved, its horses dying, its morale approaching the terminal. Within a week, he had opened a supply line they called the Cracker Line. Within 3 weeks, he had broken the Confederate siege and driven Bragg's army off Missionary Ridge in one of the most visually dramatic moments of the entire war, a spontaneous assault uphill that his staff couldn't quite explain because Grant hadn't ordered it, but which Grant, watching from below, somehow didn't stop because he'd read the moment and understood that momentum mattered more than control. That was a different kind of intelligence, not the logistical architect of Vicksburg, but the battlefield reader, the man who could feel the inflection point in real time. He had both, in different registers, and that combination was nearly unprecedented. Lincoln gave him command of all Union armies in March 1964. The appointment carried with it an implicit charge that went beyond what was written in the orders. The war was 3 years old. The Union had more men, more money, more industrial capacity, more railroad, more food, more ships, and more of almost everything than the Confederacy did. It was losing anyway. Or at least it was not winning, which in a war of this scale amounted to the same thing. The reason it was not winning had a name, and that name was not Robert E. Lee. It was the series of Union commanders who had faced Lee and failed to convert the North's material advantage into a military one. McClellan had had the advantage and spent it on caution. Pope had had the advantage and spent it on arrogance. Burnside had had the advantage and spent it on a frontal assault at Fredericksburg that was so obviously futile that men were reportedly weeping as they walked into it. Hooker had had the advantage and spent it on a plan that was, until Lee neutralized it with one of the most daring flanking maneuvers in the history of the war, nearly brilliant. Meade had had the advantage at Gettysburg, had won the battle decisively, and had then let Lee's army walk back into Virginia. Every one of these men, in the moment when the thing could have been finished, had hesitated. Lee had known they would hesitate because he understood the psychological grammar of the professional soldier trained in the European tradition, the instinct to consolidate, to protect what had been won, to respect the initiative of an opponent who clearly knew what he was doing. He had built his entire operational philosophy around that hesitation. He could not beat the Union in a war of attrition. He knew that. What he could do was make the Union's commanders afraid to close with him, afraid of what it would cost, afraid of what he might do while they were deciding. He could make them hesitant. And hesitation, multiplied across 3 years of campaigning, had done what battlefield losses had not. It had kept the Confederacy alive. Then, Grant came east. The appointment produced a specific conversation among Lee's staff, a conversation that has been imperfectly preserved, but whose outlines are clear enough. His officers asked him what he thought of the new commander. They expected reassurance. The marble general was not given to expressing anxiety, and he had earned the right to confidence. What they got instead was something quieter and more honest. Lee said, in various formulations recorded by various witnesses, that Grant was not like the others, that he would not be maneuvered, that he would come on and keep coming, and that the war they had been fighting, the war of position and nerve and the brilliant counterstroke, was over. What was coming now was a different kind of war, and Lee did not say this with enthusiasm. That was the warning. What Lee had recognized and what his officers, still intoxicated on the memory of Chancellorsville and the Valley and a dozen smaller wonders, were slow to absorb, was that Grant represented the logical end of the Union's actual strategic situation. The North did not need genius, it needed persistence. It needed a commander who would treat the Army of Northern Virginia not as an opponent to be outmaneuvered, but as a problem to be ground down, who would accept the costs of direct engagement as the price of the only strategy that could actually work. Lee could not generate that kind of endurance on the Confederate side. The South's manpower was limited, its industrial base was limited, its railroad network was deteriorating, its currency was collapsing. Every month the war continued was a month that cost the Confederacy more than it cost the Union, in relative terms. Lee had bought time by brilliance, but brilliance against Grant was a diminishing asset. The Overland Campaign began on May 4, 1864, when Grant crossed the Rapidan River with approximately 120,000 men. He moved into the wilderness, the same tangled second-growth forest where Lee had wrecked Hooker a year earlier, and Lee, reading the terrain as only a man who'd fought there before could, immediately brought his army to meet him in the woods where Grant's superior numbers would count for less. The Battle of the Wilderness was 2 days of the most savage, disorienting combat in the history of the war, fought in country so dense that men couldn't see the men shooting at them, where the smoke of musketry mixed with the smoke of forest fires ignited by artillery, where wounded men burned alive in the underbrush, and their screaming was added to the general noise of destruction. Grant lost roughly 18,000 men in 2 days. Lee lost somewhere around 11,000. By the metrics that had governed this war for 3 years, Grant should have pulled back north of the Rapidan. That was what you did after taking 18,000 casualties in 2 days. That was what McClellan had done after Antietam. That was what the grammar of the thing demanded. Grant's army expected it. Lee's army expected it. The Confederate soldiers watching from the southern tree line expected it. Grant turned south. The army understood, in that moment, something important. Not a proclamation, not a speech, just the column turning away from Washington and toward Richmond, and the men who'd been dreading the retreat they thought was coming, suddenly understanding that the retreat wasn't coming, that what they were doing instead was moving around Lee's flank, pressing him south, refusing to give him the operational breathing room he needed. The veteran soldiers reportedly cheered. Some of them wept. They had been doing this for 3 years, fighting and bleeding and retreating and fighting again, and here was a man who apparently intended to do something different. What followed, Spotsylvania, the North Anna, Cold Harbor, was not a series of victories in the conventional sense. Cold Harbor in particular was a catastrophe at the tactical level, a frontal assault on heavily entrenched Confederate positions that cost Grant approximately 7,000 men in less than an hour. It was the worst mistake of his career, and he said so later, with a directness that was characteristic of him. But the campaign, evaluated at the strategic level rather than the tactical one, was doing exactly what Grant intended. Lee's army was being pinned, bled, and forced backward. It could not rest. It could not detach forces